Hello, this is Theresa Baker, and I'm going to talk today about collecting data and storing data for human subject research using REDCap. Today's dynamic world bombards us with data from multiple sources throughout every aspect of our life. We've been told how important it is to collect data, to do it in the clinic, in the classroom, collect data on our progress, collect data on anything and everything you could possibly consider. Then, once you've collected this data, you have to turn it into something actionable. Maybe that means grant dollars for your next study or justification for research administration. No matter what you plan to do with your data, there's a few critical steps in this narrative that's missing from the collect to the action item. This is: what do I collect? How do I collect it? Where do I put it? And what do I do with it after I've collected it in the raw format? Let's start with the first one. What do I collect? You start by defining your goal. You identify the information you're going to need and you prioritize this information. Consider the who, how, what. Who is collecting the information? Who is the information about? How will everything be collected? What is necessary to draw the conclusion at the end? In other words, you're going to make your fill in result section. We observed blank had a blank result to tell us blank. I like to give my elephant slide at this point because elephants have the longest memory. So if you walk away with nothing else today, this is the most important slide of the day. No matter what information you're trying to collect, always, always, always start at the end and work your way backwards into the questions that you need to ask. Identify your main objective. Create your empty tables and figures that you plan to fill in with the answers of your main objective. What are the numbers, math, and responses you're going to need to fill in those empty tables? What is the questions you're going to need to ask to find that number? And how will you find that number? At this point, you're going to create the questions. Each question you ask should be going somewhere up this ladder towards your objective. Remember, we are bombarded with data. Incorporating unnecessary data that have nothing to do with your goal introduces risk during analysis and it exhausts resources. So, why would you want to store data in a database and not a spreadsheet? To answer this, we really need to understand the difference between the two and how the data you collect is stored and processed. Spreadsheets are built to present data in tables that can be turned into graphs and charts. Spreadsheets are an essential tool to facilitate the movement of your data through storage, to analysis, to presentation. However, they are not intended to be the storage. That's what the database is for. A database is a program that organizes your data. It tags each component and it gives metadata to every item. When I put an item into my database, it is categorized, tagged, and placed in locations that make it easy to find and present when it's needed for analysis from various angles. So let's go through an example. You have a recipe, you want to make something. So you go through and you make a list of all the ingredients you're going to need. This is going to be your graph, your chart, your table that you plan to use to answer your main objective. In order to make your recipe, you're going to go shopping and you place all the ingredients on your list into your shopping cart. This is your spreadsheet you're going to use to create your graph, your chart, your table that's going to be used to answer your main objective. Each grocery store is set up a little bit different. However, the ingredients you need to categorize by where it is found in all stores. So your fresh produce is going to be placed together and your dairy items are going to be placed together. Within each of those sections, your fruit is going to be separated and tagged different from your vegetables. Similarly, your database is going to be tagged with your data elements and it's going to associate it with your identified attributes. When you collect your data in a systematic method, the relationship between the entity and the associations are established. So you know that when the fruit truck arrives, the fresh Honeycrisp apples are going to be located in the produce section under the apple bin in a very specific location. Now, that was a very basic example of what happens when you collect data and you store it in a database. There's many advantages and disadvantages to databases and spreadsheets, and understanding the difference between the two can help you find the best place to be putting your data. So, items that you need to consider when thinking about which one to use include the number of users, tracking, any themes, the amount of data that you're collecting, what's the relationship, and any data integrity challenges you might incorporate. Clinical research data should always be stored in a database. Only information that is being analyzed for tables, graphs, and charts should be placed in a spreadsheet. Data collected for clinical research has some additional privacy and regulatory requirements that must be met. This means that all patient-level data must be collected in a HIPAA-compliant system. If you're collecting data that's going to be used for the FDA submission, an extra layer is required. 21 CFR Part 11 is the FDA's guidelines on electronic records and electronic signatures. Additional measures must be met for this information that's going to be collected and stored this way. In the clinical world, this is where an electronic data capture tool comes into play. An EDC is a software built to collect clinical research data. Although it is mostly used for research data, it also has the ability to collect student information, financial information, because the regulatory considerations that govern an EDC also are applicable to those. EDCs have the ability to collect information from within the software, such as a clinician viewing a participant. It can also collect in an external view, such as a participant directly entering their own survey information. The main reason to go with REDCap is that it was built by clinical researchers specifically for clinical research, and it's free to you. So, what is REDCap? REDCap stands for Research Data Electronic Capture. It's a web-based application built by Vanderbilt in 2004 and is used to create and manage data. This means that REDCap can facilitate the collection, storage, and retrieval of your data. This is a portion of the data management process, which incorporates everything that happens from the information collected during the project and how it's preserved and shared after the project. REDCap can collect information by an authenticated user log into the system, and then data entry is completed. Or it can also send a public link or a unique link to people for them to complete their own forms. Once the data is in the system, REDCap then organizes and stores the information in a manner that makes it easy to retrieve. First, it can function to collect clinical research forms. This is a form that the researcher or the clinician would fill out information. This is typically observational information collected in the clinic or community setting. However, it could also be information such as staff reviews of grant applications, study regulatory files, or even benefit management. The information is only the first step in preparing for analysis. The second option is it could be used as an EDC. The second EDC feature that could be primarily used is a patient reported outcome software. An example of this would be a quality of life survey, which is typically filled out by a patient and then it's given to the clinician. You could also use this feature to collect W-9s for the participant or deviations to the protocol, certified copies of field notes during community collection events, things like that. And the third big function that I really want to point out is its ability to generate reports and export information. If you want to be able to get your data in an actionable state, you're going to need to do something with the raw data. So collecting and storing the information is only the first step. One additional feature that REDCap can do is it can automate emails, text to various stakeholders under conditional formatting. So, for example, at the end of an electronic consent, REDCap can automatically trigger a copy of the signed consent to go to the participant and even automate an email to the business office for the CLIN card payment. These can have information for justification of the next step to be automatically attached. It's a very helpful feature. I often call REDCap my research admin since the software does a lot of the stuff for me that I would normally have to do on my own after the visit. Anyways, there's a few benefits of using an EDC that I really want to point out. The first is that the access is password protected and the software is HIPAA compliant. Locally, our REDCap is hosted at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center in the Biomedical Informatics divisions. These servers are backed up regularly and controlled internally. It is very easy to set up a database. It takes a limited amount of knowledge to build a project. Once you've built your project, many people can access the system at the same time. And since it's web-based, it only takes an internet connection to be able to get in. So, what kind of data is typically stored is a pretty big variety. It's possible for you to collect your research data in the clinic. You can collect it in the community. You can do a retrospective data, or if it's coming from a secondary source, or that needs to be stored safely for your protocol. Um, And so, what you would normally do in order to set it up is you would first start by determining what information you want to collect, and then you would plan how you're going to collect it. The third thing you would do is you would determine what data collection method you're going to use. Then you're going to collect your data, and then after you're done with that, you're going to analyze your data and look for your findings. So the first thing that you need to do when you're developing your protocol is you need to make a data map. This is a linear function of what you're going to do one step after another step for each question and turning that into forms, and those forms into who does what at what point. So when you're developing that schematic, you need to identify who are the stakeholders, who are the people that are doing each of the actions. You need to decide what form are they filling out and where does each of those data components fit into the bigger picture of your project. And you also need to take into consideration at this point things like, is there going to be more than one visit, or is there going to be one time, like one visit only, that kind of component. So this is the big picture of how the data is going to flow from one spot to the next. After you have kind of identified what your instrument architecture is going to be, what your data map is going to look like, it's time for you to start building. So you start the development mode by requesting a project and going ahead and designing your data forms in your workflow. Now, you really should be doing this while you're developing your protocol too, because you want to be able to do testing and make sure that what you put into your protocol is something that you can actually do um, when you're building your pieces out. Otherwise, you might have to make some adjustments in your protocol, or you might even have to make adjustments in your data plan. So, after you have an approved protocol and you have tested your database and it's working the way you want it to go, you're going to move it from development mode into what's called production mode. This is where you're doing your active study data collection. Now, things occur in the middle of study collection, and sometimes you might need to make a pivot and have a change to a question, additional forms, things like that. You do have the ability while you're in production mode to enter what's called a draft mode. This is where you can keep collecting data the way that it's currently approved and build out whatever piece you might need to change or adjust. Once you feel you are ready to put that draft mode into production, you can switch that on into the active state, and you'll just continue to move forward with your data collection. There doesn't have to be a stop or a pause if you don't want there to be, but there could be. You could put it into an inactive state if that's something you might need to do. You get to the end of your study, you close your study out, and it's time to close out the database. You can turn it into an archived state, and you could eventually even have it terminate the database at the very, very end of your data collection and whatever it is that you have in your protocol. So that first step was creating a project. Now, when you create a project, you have some components that kind of go at the very beginning. The first is your title of your project. Uh, at Cincinnati Children's, we put the person that owns the project first with the number of the ticket for what was requested, at which point you get to decide what the project name is going to be. The second item that we need to know is what's the purpose of the project. And if it is a research project, we need to know who that PI is, what the approved IRB a protocol number would be, and how you are using it. And then the third piece of information that is really critical for your project is that project notes section. This is where all your metadata goes. At this point, you're going to describe what your project is. You're going to provide project owner and designee names and contact information. You're going to add any supporting information or metadata that needs to go with the project. And that's a really important tool to have for longevity of understanding what's happening to that project. After you have got your project started, you're going to start off by building in the project setup and design location. This is the section for the basic REDCap features where you're going to decide, is it going to be longitudinal? Is it going to be not longitudinal? Is it going to be a survey or not a survey? Is it going to have, like, what are the user rates going to be? Those kinds of components. So in general, the steps that are under your project setup and design, they need to be completed in the order, and you really should not change these features after it's placed in production. It is kind of important to pay attention to this step because if you accidentally um, change a piece that's in your project setup, you have the possibility of orphaning some of your data, and uh, then you wouldn't be able to easily find it. So the project setup page is probably one of those places you do in the order that it's there, and you just follow the steps as is. So on the project setup page, the things that you're going to do here is you're going to start by setting up the basic pieces of your project. Then you're going to go to your online designer. You got a few different options in your online designer. You could go to the REDCap library where you would be able to import validated instruments. You could import an instrument from another project. You could go to the data dictionary and build in an advanced feature. You can enable your surveys here and set up your survey queues. You can automate your invitations at this location. You can build out notifications, and this is where you're going to do your alerts, and your notifications also would be at this step. After you have built your instruments, you're going to check that all of your fields that may have PHI and or any identifying information are checked at this point. There is another feature that it falls after your identifier check, which is called additional options. At this location, you can do things like repeatable instruments, your secondary identifier, you can set up your data quality workflow, and things like that. Your next feature that you could set up is a bookmark. This would be a link that's in your project that allows you to go outside your project to something else. You could link it to another project, or you could go to another website. And then lastly, before you're testing, you need to do your user rights. User rights is where you're going to identify who inside the project is allowed to do what. And you're going to kind of divvy up the abilities for people to do things at this point. So your main thing that you're going to do after your project setup is kind of started is you're really going to spend most of your energy and time in the online designer and or the data dictionary. This is where you're building your forms and your surveys. And when you're building in the online designer or the data dictionary, what you're doing is you're building out your database. So you're building out that grocery store. This is what the online designer looks like. It's a snapshot of an example of one. You can see at the top here is my username. You can see the name of my project. You can see a data collection instrument gray box here. Inside it, you can create a new instrument. These are your instruments here. An instrument is kind of like a form. You could call it a data form. It's an interchangeable word. You could import something from the REDCap library here. You could import something from another project. Your piece right here is going to show you whether you have this form enabled as a survey, which means a participant might be able to fill it out themselves in a web page. And if you do have it enabled, you can go and do your survey settings and or your automated invitations. The online designer is your primary tool, and it's really designed for data forms. The default data form is entitled My First Instrument. So the very first time you ever make one, that's what it's going to be titled. The data forms are instruments, and you can begin by editing the name if you wanted to. When you open up your very first instrument, the very first field is called record ID. This first variable, it is a unique record or participant identifier, and it has to be preserved. You may change that by editing it and calling it something else like subject ID or participant ID or some other entity you might want to say. And you can even have a secondary identifier listed when you're in that additional options. So this field does not need to be repeated in your other data forms. You're capable of piping it across. So for each of those forms you build, they're called an instrument in REDCap. So an instrument equals a form, and a form then turns into a portion of a table that you can later on export in different ways. Once you open up those forms and you need to start making each of your components, the way you're going to do that is by building out something called data collection fields. I have a link here for you to go and view a demo of different field types and what they might look like in survey mode. They look a little different when they're in the data form. So there's a few different types of data collection fields that are available. The first one that's available is called a descriptive field. This is an informational field, and the items that would go here are not in the database. They're in the metadata of the build of the project, but whatever's there, there's nothing that's going to be placed into your exported file. So you can put instructions here or pictures here or download fields or whatever it is you want to do. You can also link to videos like a YouTube video or whatever it is you need to do. The next type of field is a text field or a note field. These are for your qualitative information. And if you have a user right that is set as tagged, let's see here, tag de-identifiers, I believe that's what it's called. Your note fields are considered identified information unless tagged otherwise. So because your participant could enter information in there that would lead a person back to knowing who that person is. So it's always going to protect the participant first, and you would have to set it to a different setting if your method is not that case. Okay, the next type of field choice is a single response or a more than response. So these are your quantitative items. You're going to have a coded value that equates with a label. So if you're doing a binary yes, no, 1 would be yes, 0 would be no. If you're doing true, false, true is 1, false is 0. You could have a slider, which is 0 to 100. And you can decide what those sliders are going to be. If you're doing a drop down or a radio button, those are going to be multiple choices but you can only choose one of those multiple choices. A checkbox is similar where you're going to have multiple choices, but you can choose more than one checkbox. Another type of field option that is available is a field upload. You can do a signature field, you could do a file field. A file field, if you are, can be any type of file. Um, and if you're using something like a tablet that has a camera, you can even capture a picture, you can do an audio file, whatever device you have that can collect a file can be uploaded at this given place. So it's good for field collection sometimes. Another field option that is available is a calculated field. It's a real-time calculation. An example of this is maybe you want today's age to be calculated. So you take the person's date of birth and today's date and you subtract, you do what's called a date diff on the two, and then you can get today's age. Another one that's a common one would be something like a BMI calculation. There's also a specialty field called a dynamic SQL field. And this is a special request. You have to go to the administrators in order to get a dynamic SQL field. But this is where you can look in another project that's in REDCap and you can pull everything that's in that column and make it into a drop-down box for you to select that option. Okay, so now you've built your project and you've got it to a state where you want to like actually put data into it. How do you get the data in? Well, we mentioned before there's two main methods. You can have an authenticated user that's going to log into the system, which is what's occurring here. So in this particular case, I am a research staff. I log into REDCap. I use a password protected login, which means I'm authenticated. When I get in, I have special permission to get into a specific project, Viva the user rights. I open that project. Now that I'm in the project, I have a few different options on what I can do. If I'm looking up an existing record, I can go to the Add Edit Records or the record dashboard. At this place, I can do any of three items. I can add a new record in both of these locations. I can manually look up a record. And if I don't know exactly what record ID it is, but I have some information, so I want to query it, I can only do that in the Add Edit Record section. I could query and search for an existing record. The other way that you could get data into REDCap is if you were a participant. And so this is called survey mode. In survey mode, you are going to a secure web page, and all information that's collected in that secure web page is automatically going straight back to that REDCap database, and it's being stored directly on the server. It's not stored on the device it's being collected on, it's stored directly on the server. There's two ways to get to a secure web page. You could use a public link, which would be something that would be for everybody and anybody, or you could have a private link that is specific to one person. So I kind of wanted to dive a little further into this concept of surveys because it can be a little confusing. There's this nuance that's a little odd. So we're going to start with the first option, which is a public link. So if you have a public link, you might have an identified person that you want to send it to. When you're using the public link, there is automatically no information in the database. So I could go in and I could invite a person. So I want to invite myself, Theresa Baker. So I'm going to send an invite. Theresa Baker, would you please take this survey? So I know Theresa Baker's email. I send an email to her and she gets an email. She clicks on a link and it comes back and it makes a record. It makes the next record in the line. When that record is made, because I knew who I sent it to, it linked it um, because I had that turned on. I had that enabled. So in that case, the survey function identified the person in the database. And so the survey went, oh, this person is record number 1. My other option is to have it set anonymously. So a record goes out, maybe it's placed on a flyer. I don't know who the person is that clicks the link. They click the link, they create the next record down. In this particular case, because they came in through the survey, there is no linkage that has occurred. The survey does not know who that person is in the database. However, the database knows the person did a survey. They might not know who that survey is or that person is unless you have some kind of identifier built into your questions, but they do know that it was created in a survey mode. Okay, so that's one method. If you're doing anonymous surveys, you kind of need to think about this particular mode because you can do a completely anonymous survey, and you can also get yourself stuck in a situation where you're trying to link something, but you accidentally don't. Once it's set anonymous, there is no way to go backwards and link it. That's not possible to do. So an unlinked record can never be let's see here, the best way to put it is the survey goes to the database, but the database does not go to the survey. I think that's the best way to explain it. Okay. That's if you're using a public link. Now, the next option is, let's say you want to do a private link. If you're doing a private link, this is not the same as an identified email that you're sending an invitation to. This is someone who's already in your database. They already have a record. They are record number one. Their email's there, their name's there, something in there has already been created for that person, and you want to send them an invite. So you use an automated survey invitation or alert and notification. You send them an email with a very specific link that takes them back into their record, and it places whatever additional information you're asking them to provide. It either puts it into the existing instrument, into a new instrument, but it attaches it to the record that private link has associated the two pieces. Okay, I know it's a little confusing. So what happens to the data? How does it present itself on the back end? And it's kind of an important piece to understand where each of those components are going. So let's go back to our grocery store. If you're thinking about your grocery store, think about, where are the apples? Where are the bananas? Where are the cabbages and the carrots in your produce area, right? So you've got little bins and you want your data to go into those little bins. And each of these cells that you see is a bin. So what you need to think about is, how do I associate the record? How is the record collected? The first thing you need to know is that each person or each individual record, depending on what you're identifying as a record, is a row. And then if you have a longitudinal study, your record could have more than one row. You could have a row for today, you could have a row for tomorrow, you could have a row for the next day, but all three of those rows are associated with this one person. That's that record. Okay. The next thing you need to kind of understand is what happens to the data itself. So every variable item that you collect becomes a variable in a column format. So it could be a coded value. It could be those note and text values with a qualitative value. And the reason this is important is you need to think for a few minutes about a few different things. If you're doing a checkbox, that's a binary. Something's either checked or not checked, which means you're going to get multiple columns. If you are going to do something that needs to have derived variables where you have like height and weight, and then you're going to make some math to equal the BMI, in a third column, that's three different columns. So thinking through what each of those columns mean and how they get you back to your big picture. Remember that great big triangle, my elephant slide. How are you getting each of those variables back up to your objective? What's happening math-wise from column 1 to column 2 to column 3? So how it's presented here is kind of an important feature into what you're going to do with it on the back end. So if you wanted to add a row, you could do a few different things. You could add it in that add edit function. You want to add a person. That's one way that it would occur. And what would occur is it would just add row 3 on the bottom piece. The other option that you could do is you could import data. You can import pieces in the fields way that you want. And REDCap does also have the ability to only take the component pieces that you might need. You don't need to upload all the fields and all the existing fields. In fact, it's recommended you don't. You should only upload what you need to upload so that you don't mess up any of the values that are already existing. If you do want to upload, REDCap um, stores those in a .csv file format, and then you would upload the file, and then you could go through what's called an adjudication process where you look at the data and you decide, is this the data I want to upload into that field? Is it correct or not correct? At which point you make your decision and you import the data. This is one of those user rights components that would have to be completed. Not everybody has this access, only some people have this access. The next thing that you might want to consider is, how do I get my data out? So you could look at your entire data table. You could pull the entire thing out, but maybe you want to filter pieces of it and you only want to look at a specific instrument variable component at a specific instance, and maybe you only want to look at a certain set of records. So there is a reporting feature that's built into REDCap for you to kind of filter out a little bit. It's not um, a robust reporting feature because REDCap's um, main use as an EDC is for collecting data and storing data. Reporting data is typically something that's done outside and a different piece, but there is some basics that are inside REDCap. So you could create a filtered report. You can also have exports of that report so that you could subset your data. When you are exporting, there's all kinds of features that come into exporting your data. You can do it in the raw format into Excel, or you could do it in the labeled format into Excel. So raw format would be like if you're doing binary, like 1, 2, 3, 4, your coded items would come out in raw. If you're looking for your labeled formats, maybe that 1 means yes and that 0 means no, then it's going to come out and it's going to say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. So it's going to give the value that you told it that code means. You can also export into a few other statistical softwares, and you can also export an XML file. If you are, let's just, for example, let's say you're doing R and you're pulling out the data in R. When you go to export it, it's going to pull in the program for you to run the matrix for the values and building out your factors for R. And it's also going to give you the CSV file. Similar, SAS is going to give you the SAS program and so on and so forth. You can, at this point, when you're exporting your data, kind of decide, am I going to de-identify my data? Am I going to let the person know the identifiers? Am I going to have a date change, like a shift in my dates? You can also set the type of CSV file that you might want to do, especially if you're working with international folks. They might not do commas. Sometimes they'll do a different character. Okay. So those are kind of the basic ins and outs of REDCap as an EDC. You know, you can collect data. There's many ways to collect data. You can export data. There's many ways to export data. So the beginning and the end. Um, I do like to leave people with this really amazing overview of the process of data management, from anywhere from the planning stage all the way to the analysis stage. The reality of it is your data component is sprinkled throughout the study. It starts at the very beginning and it goes past the very end. It's usually one of the last things to occur after data close or after closeout. So Here is a really good kind of iterative process of what that looks like and all the steps that you need to really consider and maybe even build into your data collection pieces. So if you need to access REDCap, the way you do that is you log in at redcap.research.cchmc.org. And if you need any additional assistance or help, there is the Cincinnati REDCap Resource Center, which has it just won the 2021 REDCap Con Award for best training resource center. So it's a really good tool. The CCTST also offers classes. You can look on their event calendar for, they have an introductory class, they have a beginner's course, and they also have drop-in hours where you can just get drop-in help with the admins. Then the last thing to do is you could just contact the help desk directly at health-redcap@bmi.cchmc.org. There's very few admins. At the moment, it's Max Summers, Warren Welsh, Audrey Purdue. And so you could contact them directly and through the help desk, and they'll be able to help you. So thank you for listening with me, and I hope that you enjoy your time with REDCap.